Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, fiercely escalating debate that's currently sweeping through the healthcare and tech sectors. Think about the global medical technology industry for a second. It's this massive, multi-billion-dollar engine that produces everything from the bandages you buy at the pharmacy right down to the incredibly complex robotic surgery bays they use in modern hospitals. But recently, a brand new draft healthcare bill has surfaced, and it's got this entire industry sounding a very loud alarm. We're talking about a fundamental clash of definitions, safety protocols, and innovation, all coming down to one thing: how the government regulates the tools used to save lives every single day. Let's get into it.
So, is an MRI machine a drug? Now, on its face, that question probably sounds completely ridiculous, right? You're likely thinking, of course not. One is a massive, incredibly complex magnet you lie inside to image your internal organs, and the other is, a pill you swallow with your morning coffee to manage blood pressure. They exist in totally different realms of science and medicine. But here's the crazy part. This exact categorization dispute is at the very heart of why medical device companies are pushing back so hard against this newly proposed government legislation. It really all comes down to how we define and regulate the items that keep patients healthy.
Section 1. The proposed healthcare bill and the push for unified regulation. To figure out how we actually got to a place where machines and medicines might be treated exactly the same, we need to look at the government's push for unified regulation. Now, historically, the rules have dictated separate pathways for drugs and medical devices. Basically, oversight was based on the specific, distinct risks associated with each category. It was a bifurcated system. But the proposed draft bill envisions a unified framework. It essentially attempts to streamline government oversight by bringing both medical devices and pharmaceuticals under a single, highly stringent regulatory umbrella. The government's goal here? Administrative simplicity, easier auditing, and a much more standardized approach to managing every single product that enters a hospital ecosystem. From the perspective of the policymakers drafting this bill, this is all about creating a comprehensive, one-size-fits-all approach to patient safety. They argue that this broad, overarching approach ensures maximum safety across the board, basically closing any potential loopholes. For instance, regulators might look at a gray area, like where a complex, software-based diagnostic tool previously slipped through a less rigorous pathway, and they want a unified safety net to catch absolutely everything. But as you might guess, the medical technology industry sees things quite differently. They argue that treating all medical interventions equally, completely regardless of how they actually work mechanically or chemically, is just a fundamental flaw that could break the entire healthcare supply system.
Which brings us to Section 2, pills versus pacemakers, and the definitional clash. To really grasp the industry's vehement opposition to this bill, we've got to look closely at the actual functional, scientific differences between these products. Pharmaceuticals inherently rely on chemical, biological, or metabolic reactions within the human body. When you take a drug, it physically changes how your cells behave on a microscopic level. Medical devices, on the other hand, function through physical, mechanical, or increasingly software-driven actions. Think about a pacemaker. A pacemaker delivers an electrical pulse. It doesn't dissolve into your bloodstream to alter your cellular body chemistry. The industry argues that ignoring this functional divide is exactly like applying traffic laws designed for submarines to airplanes. They operate in completely different environments using totally different principles. So the crucial point here is right in the internationally accepted definition of a medical device. It's an instrument, apparatus, machine, or software intended for healthcare purposes. But critically, it achieves its primary intended purposes without chemical action. Let's look at a couple of real-world examples. A surgical laser uses concentrated beams of light to physically cut or ablate tissue during an operation. Or take a diagnostic AI. It analyzes millions of pixels on an X-ray to spot a microscopic bone fracture. Neither of these tools interacts with your body's chemistry the way a cough syrup or a heavy-duty antibiotic does, right? The actual mechanism of action is just entirely different. Moving on to Section 3, the industry pushback, and why A is definitely not B. Because of this stark definitional clash, medical device companies aren't just sending strongly worded emails. They are actively organizing and lobbying against the draft bill's methodology. As highlighted in recent industry reports, their core rallying cry is incredibly straightforward. It's simple, objective, and direct. Medical devices are not pharma products. The industry maintains that because the scientific mechanisms are so different, they simply shouldn't be governed by pharmaceutical rules. It's really just a plea for regulatory logic. They're arguing that the rules governing a product should accurately reflect the actual science of how that product interacts with a patient. The industry argues that regulating a pacemaker like a pill means applying highly irrelevant chemical testing standards to physical hardware. They point out that you wouldn't exactly run a metabolic toxicology panel on a titanium knee replacement, would you?
Furthermore, they claim this unified approach completely ignores the fast-paced engineering iteration cycles of modern tech. Think about it. A software developer might patch a medical application overnight to fix a minor bug or improve a user interface. But a chemical drug formula, that simply cannot be tweaked without years of brand new clinical trials. Finally, device manufacturers argue that treating devices like drugs creates massive, conflicting overlap with existing software and electronics regulations, which they claim shows a fundamental misunderstanding by regulators of how medical hardware is actually built. Let's break down how this all builds into a potential crisis, at least according to the industry's warnings. Imagine a sequence of events. First, the bill passes exactly as drafted, with these unified rules. Suddenly, highly specific pharmaceutical compliance is required for physical devices and software. The industry warns this leads directly to the next domino, a massive backlog of regulatory approvals. Why? Well, because government agencies generally don't have legions of software engineers cross-trained in pharmacological compliance just sitting around ready to process these redundant, mismatched checks. Because regulators and companies would be navigating tests that don't align with the technology, the pipeline of new technology simply grinds to a halt. The end result? Stalled medical innovation across the board.
Section 4. The patient impact. Let's look at what this actually means for healthcare.
Now, regulatory backlogs might sound like a purely bureaucratic nightmare, stuff that's just confined to corporate boardrooms and government halls. But this has a very real impact on you and me when we need to go to the hospital. The ultimate fear expressed by the medical tech sector is delayed access to life-saving technology. Just think about an ultrasound machine that receives a software update to sharpen its image resolution, something that could help doctors spot tumors earlier. If companies are bogged down trying to prove to a regulatory body that this digital update passes what the industry argues is an impossible and highly irrelevant chemical toxicology test, well, it could severely delay your access to that next-generation diagnostic tool.
And this really perfectly illustrates the real-world consequence. Under the current dedicated pathway designed specifically for devices, the approval wait times are relatively short and efficient because they're built to test mechanical safety and software reliability. But if pharmaceutical-level clinical trial timelines, which, by the way, often span a decade to observe long-term cellular effects, are applied to fast-iterating technology like heart rate monitors or diagnostic algorithms, hypothetical wait times could quadruple. We're talking an exponential increase in the time and cost required to develop these tools. And naturally, those increased costs and those painfully long delays are ultimately passed right down to the healthcare systems and the patients who desperately need them. Now, we have to be completely fair here. The government's goal of rigorous patient safety is entirely valid. Absolutely nobody wants unsafe, untested devices in hospitals, and regulatory oversight is obviously essential. But the challenge we're unpacking in this explainer is a classic regulatory tightrope, balancing safety and innovation. Imagine being a regulator tasked with writing a single, unified safety rule that perfectly applies to both a liquid aspirin formula and a wireless AI heart monitor. It is an incredibly difficult task. The difficulty lies in designing a regulatory framework that meticulously protects the public from harm, but doesn't inadvertently suffocate the engineering and development of the physical tools that doctors rely on every single day. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely crucial question to ponder as this high-stakes legislative battle unfolds in real time. How will policymakers bridge the gap between patient safety and medical innovation without regulating scalpels as if they were prescriptions? Can the draft bill be successfully revised to protect patients while acknowledging the fundamental, scientific reality that a machine is simply not a medicine? The outcome of this regulatory clash is, without a doubt, going to shape the speed and quality of our future healthcare. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep your eyes on how this legislation evolves and never stop being curious.